The day Robert Mitchell discovered the fence was the day his quiet suburban life imploded. He stood at the edge of his property, morning coffee growing cold in his hand, staring in disbelief at the gleaming white vinyl barrier that had appeared overnight. The fence cut a clean line through what had been, just yesterday, the eastern edge of his backyard, slicing off nearly a quarter-acre of the land he'd owned for 15 years. What the hell? Robert muttered, setting his mug on a nearby stump and approaching the fence. He ran his hand along the smooth surface, noting how professionally it had been installed. This was no amateur job. The posts were sunk deep, the panels perfectly aligned. Whoever had done this had spent considerable time and money. Robert glanced at his watch, 6:45 a.m. Too early to start knocking on doors, but his blood was already boiling. He knew exactly who was responsible: the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, the same organization that had been sending him increasingly aggressive letters about his non-conforming landscape features for the past 3 months. What they called non-conforming features, Robert called his award-winning native plant garden, a carefully cultivated acre of indigenous flora that had been featured in regional gardening magazines and served as a sanctuary for local pollinators. Unlike his neighbor's chemical-soaked, perfectly manicured lawns, Robert's property was a vibrant ecosystem, one he spent years developing with scientific precision. The HOA had made their disapproval clear, but this, physically seizing part of his land, was beyond anything he could have imagined. Robert pulled out his phone and took dozens of photographs, documenting the fence from every angle. Then he walked the entire perimeter of his property, discovering to his horror that nearly 10,000 square feet of his land had been effectively confiscated. Worse still, the fence had destroyed a section of rare prairie grasses he'd been cultivating for over a decade. As a retired environmental lawyer, Robert understood property rights better than most. He spent 30 years defending landowners against corporate encroachment. The irony wasn't lost on him that in his retirement, he was facing a battle of his own. Back inside his modest craftsman home, Robert spread out his property surveys on the dining room table. The boundaries were unambiguous. The HOA had unquestionably overstepped, both figuratively and literally. His deed clearly showed that the land now behind the fence belonged to him, not to the community's common areas as the HOA had recently begun claiming. His phone rang. The caller ID displayed Margaret Whitfield, the current HOA president, the former corporate executive who moved to Oak Ridge Estates 3 years ago and immediately begun a campaign to elevate community standards. Robert let it ring 4 times, taking deep breaths to compose himself. When he finally answered, his voice was calm, measured, the same tone he used in countless legal negotiations. "Margaret, I assume you're calling about the fence that appeared on my property overnight." "Robert, good morning. Yes, the fence installation was completed yesterday evening. The board voted unanimously to reclaim the eastern buffer zone for community use. You received our notices. Notices claiming land that legally belongs to me. Land I pay taxes on. Land that's clearly defined in my property deed." Margaret's voice took on the condescending tone that had made her deeply unpopular with many residents. The community bylaws clearly state that the HOA reserves the right to modify property lines for the benefit of all residents. Your unusual gardening choices were affecting neighboring property values. We had no choice but to act. Robert's fingers tightened around the phone, but his voice remained steady. "Margaret, you've made a very serious error in judgment. I'll be in touch through my attorney." As he hung up, Robert already knew this would be the fight of his retirement. What the Oak Ridge Estates HOA didn't realize was that they had just declared war on the wrong homeowner. By noon, Robert's dining room had transformed into a war room. Spread across the oak table were property surveys, HOA bylaws, county regulations, and 15 years of correspondence with the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. His former legal assistant, Teresa Gones, now retired herself, sat across from him reviewing documents with the same sharp attention to detail that had made them a formidable team in court. They'd overplay their hand, Rob, Teresa said, highlighting a passage in the HOA covenant. This clause they're citing about modifying property lines refers to easements for utilities and drainage, not outright annexation of private property. Robert nodded, a grim smile forming. "And they put it in writing. Margaret actually emailed me claiming the board's authority to reclaim my land." "Reclaim?" Teresa snorted. "They can't reclaim what was never theirs." The doorbell rang and Robert's neighbor, Jim Padilla, stood on the porch with 2 other homeowners. Jim, a construction contractor who lived 3 doors down, had been fighting his own battles with the HOA over his work truck, which Margaret insisted was commercial equipment that could be parked in his driveway. "We saw the fence," Jim said without preamble, "and we're with you, whatever you need." Inside, the group gathered around Robert's kitchen island. Carla Winters, a retired history professor, placed a folder on the counter. "I've been documenting HOA overreach for 2 years," she explained. "Selective enforcement, arbitrary rule changes, financial discrepancies. The new board under Margaret has been operating like a dictatorship. The fourth member of the group, Dennis Takahashi, a quiet software engineer who rarely attended HOA meetings, spoke up. They've been targeting anyone who doesn't fit their aesthetic vision. They fined me $500 for having solar panels that were visibly disruptive to community harmony, whatever that means. Robert leaned against the counter, processing this information. So it's not just me. Not by a long shot, Carla confirmed, but you're the first one they've stolen land from. And honestly, you're the one they should have been most afraid of picking a fight with. Robert's phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from the county assessor's office, confirming receipt of his request for an official review of his property lines. Next to it was a calendar notification for his appointment with Catherine Barnett, a former colleague and one of the state's top property rights attorneys, scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow. They think this is about a garden, Robert said, looking at the concerned faces of his neighbors. But it's about something much more fundamental. If they can take my land, they can take anyone's. Jim crossed his arms. So what's the plan, counselor? First, documentation. I need statements from all of you about similar HOA actions. Teresa will help collect those. He turned to Jim. Can you bring some equipment tomorrow to take precise measurements of the property lines versus the fence placement? Jim nodded. I've got laser surveying equipment. We'll get it down to the centimeter. Dennis, I'll need technical help. The HOA must have digital records, financial statements, meeting minutes. Can you help with that? The software engineer smiled for the first time. Already on it. Their security is inadequate. Carla, our historian. I need a complete timeline of HOA actions, especially since Margaret took over. Patterns of behavior will be crucial. As his neighbors left with their assignments, Robert received another call. It was his son, Michael, an environmental scientist at the state university. Dad, I just heard from Mom. This is insane. Those plants you're cultivating include 3 species on the state's conservation watch list. The environmental angle alone could trigger regulatory involvement. Robert felt the familiar strategic clarity that had served him so well in his legal career. Can you come by tomorrow with documentation on that? And bring your camera gear. I want high-resolution images of everything they destroyed. After hanging up, Robert walked back to his property line, studying the fence that had appeared so suddenly. Beyond it, he could see Margaret Whitfield standing in the newly annexed land, directing a landscaping crew that was already ripping out his native plants to replace them with sod. She noticed him watching and walked over, stopping just on her side of the fence. Robert, I hope you've reconsidered your position. The board's decision is final, and fighting it will only create unnecessary tension in the community. Robert met her gaze calmly. Margaret, I've spent my career defending property rights. Do you really think I don't understand exactly what laws you've broken here? This isn't just about bylaws anymore. What you've done constitutes criminal trespass, property destruction, and theft. Margaret's confident expression faltered slightly. Our legal counsel assures us. Your legal counsel is about to earn their retainer the hard way, Robert interrupted. I'm not some retiree you can intimidate with threatening letters and arbitrary fines. You've stolen my land and destroyed protected plant species. By this time next week, you'll be facing not just my civil suit, but potentially state environmental violations. He turned to walk away, then paused. Oh, and Margaret, I tell that landscaping crew to stop work immediately. Every plant they remove adds to the damages. As he walked back to his house, Robert felt a familiar fire igniting within him, the same determination that had carried him through countless legal battles. The HOA had picked the wrong property to seize and the wrong homeowner to bully. This was no longer just about a fence, it was about justice. And Robert Mitchell was just getting started. Catherine Barnett's corner office overlooked the city skyline, but her attention was fixed entirely on the documents spread across her desk. A seasoned property rights attorney with 28 years of experience, she had worked alongside Robert for more than a decade before he retired. Now, watching him methodically present his case against the Oak Ridge Estates HOA, she was reminded why he'd been such a formidable opponent in court. So they built the fence overnight, without notice, claiming authority under this clause, she asked, tapping a highlighted section of the HOA covenant. Yes, and when confronted, Margaret Whitfield explicitly stated they were reclaiming the land for community use. Robert passed her a printed email, in writing. Catherine read the email, her expression darkening. This isn't just overreach, Rob. This is textbook conversion, civil theft. And the property damage to protected species. She shook her head. The environmental violations alone could trigger state intervention. That's what Michael said. He's documenting everything today with his research team. Catherine made some notes, then looked up her old colleague. What's your goal here? Restoration of property? Damages? Dissolution of the current board? All of the above, Robert replied without hesitation. I want my land back fully restored. I want compensation for the destruction of my conservation work. And I want Margaret Whitfield and her cronies removed from any position of authority. And the $2 million? Robert's expression hardened. That's not hyperbole. Between the property value, the decade of research destroyed, the conservation impact, and the punitive damages for such a flagrant violation, $2 million is conservative. Catherine nodded slowly. I agree. Actually, we might be looking at more when we factor in the environmental impact. She tapped her pen against the desk. We need to move quickly. I'll file for an emergency injunction today to prevent any further alterations to your property. Then we'll prepare the civil suit. As Robert left Catherine's office, his phone buzzed with texts from his neighbors. Dennis had uncovered financial records showing that HOA had diverted maintenance funds to pay for the fence installation, another clear violation of their bylaws. Jim had completed the property survey, confirming with GPS precision that the fence encroached 27 feet into Robert's land at its furthest point. And Carla had assembled a dossier of selective enforcement actions that painted a damning picture of the current board's behavior. By late afternoon, Robert's driveway hosted an unusual gathering. Michael had arrived with 3 colleagues from the university's environmental science department, all carefully cataloging and photographing the destroyed habitat. State environmental protection officials, responding with surprising speed to Michael's report about the protected species, were taking soil samples and documenting the damage. A surveyor from the county assessor's office was verifying the property lines with Jim's help. From her driveway 3 houses down, Margaret Whitfield watched the activity with growing alarm. When she recognized the state environmental officials' vehicles, she marched toward Robert's property, her face flushed with anger. What is the meaning of this? She demanded, stopping at the edge of Robert's driveway. This is harassment. Robert, who was speaking with one of the environmental officials, excused himself and approached Margaret. No, Margaret, this is consequences. The creek lily, prairie gentian, and kankakee mallow that your crew destroyed yesterday are all on the state conservation watch list. That makes this an environmental violation on top of property theft. Margaret's composure slipped further. Those were weeds. Unsightly, non-conforming weeds that were lowering everyone's property values. One of Michael's colleagues, a botanist specializing in endangered species, overheard and approached them. Actually, ma'am, those weeds represent one of the most successful private conservation efforts in the county. Mr. Mitchell's work has been documented in 3 scientific journals. Margaret ignored him, focusing her ire on Robert. The board acted within its rights. Our attorney reviewed everything. Your attorney, Robert replied calmly, should have advised you that no HOA covenant can supersede state property law, regardless of what you voted on in your board meeting. But we'll address that in court. Court. Margaret's voice rose. You're suing the HOA over some plants and a few feet of land? This is absurd. No, Margaret. I'm suing the HOA for theft of property, destruction of protected species, breach of fiduciary duty, and violation of state environmental regulations. And I'm naming you personally in the suit for directing these actions. The color drained from Margaret's face. Me personally? You can't do that. I was acting in my capacity as board president. Board members aren't shielded from personal liability when they knowingly direct illegal actions, Robert explained, his tone almost professorial. Something your attorney should have mentioned. A black SUV pulled into the driveway and Catherine Barnett emerged with a manila envelope. Robert, she called, walking toward them. The judge granted our emergency injunction. All work on the disputed property must cease immediately, and the HOA is prohibited from taking any further action until our hearing next week. She handed Margaret a document. This is for you, Mrs. Whitfield. The court has also ordered the preservation of all HOA records, communications, and financial documents. Margaret stared at the legal document, her hands shaking slightly. This is ridiculous. We weren't improving the neighborhood. By stealing land and destroying protected plants? Catherine asked mildly. We'll countersue. Margaret threatened, clutching the injunction. This is a frivolous lawsuit. I look forward to that, Catherine replied with the confident smile that had intimidated opposing counsel for decades. In fact, please do. Discovery should be fascinating. As Margaret stormed away, Robert turned to Catherine. That went about as expected. Catherine nodded. They always think the rules don't apply to them. By the way, the state EPA office called me directly after reviewing Michael's report. They're sending a full assessment team tomorrow. This case just got bigger, Robert. Later that evening, as Robert sat on his back porch looking at the white fence gleaming in the fading light, his phone rang. It was Greg Mendelson, the HOA's attorney, calling to explore paths to resolution. With all due respect, Greg, Robert replied, that path begins with the immediate removal of the fence, full restoration of my property, and Margaret Whitfield's resignation from the board. There was a long pause before Greg responded. Those are significant demands, Robert. "They're just the starting point," Robert corrected him. "The state EPA is involved now. This isn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore." After he hung up, Robert received a text from Dennis. "Meeting in progress at Margaret's house. 5 board members plus attorney." They looked worried. Robert smiled for the first time in days. The HOA had bulldozed their way through the neighborhood for years, hiding behind bylaws and selective enforcement. They had counted on homeowner apathy and intimidation to maintain their power. But they had made a critical error in judgment when they set their sights on his land. Now the fight was just beginning. And unlike the other residents they had bullied into compliance, Robert Mitchell knew exactly how to fight back. The Oak Ridge County Courthouse buzzed with unusual energy for Thursday morning. Courtroom 3B was filled beyond capacity, with residents from Oak Ridge Estates occupying most of the gallery. Local media had caught wind of the case, a David versus Goliath story about a retired environmental lawyer fighting an overzealous HOA had proven irresistible to reporters. Robert sat beside Catherine at the plaintiff's table, reviewing the presentation one final time. Across the aisle, Margaret Whitfield sat stiffly between Greg Mendelson and an unfamiliar attorney from a prestigious downtown firm. Apparently, the HOA had decided to bring in reinforcements. Judge Eleanor Harmon, known for her no-nonsense approach and expertise in property law, entered the courtroom. After the preliminaries, she peered over her reading glasses at both parties. "I've reviewed the briefs, and I must say this is one of the more extraordinary property disputes to come before my court. Let's begin with the plaintiff's motion for preliminary injunction." Catherine rose and approached the podium. "Your Honor, this case represents an unprecedented overreach by a homeowners association. The facts are straightforward. The Oak Ridge Estates HOA, under the direction of Board President Margaret Whitfield, physically seized a portion of my client's legally deeded property by erecting a fence 27 feet inside his property line, without notice or consent. She presented the property surveys, deed records, and before and after photographs on the courtroom's display screens. As you can see, there is no ambiguity regarding the property boundaries. Mr. Mitchell has owned and maintained this land for 15 years. Judge Harmon studied the documentation and the HOA's justification for this action. They claim authority under a vague bylaw regarding community aesthetic standards and a provision about modifying property lines for utilities, which clearly doesn't apply here. The judge turned toward the defense table. "Mr. Mendelson, I'm curious about your response to these allegations." The HOA's attorney rose nervously. "Your Honor, the Oak Ridge Estates HOA has broad discretionary powers to maintain community standards. The eastern portion of Mr. Mitchell's property borders common areas, and his unconventional landscaping was affecting property values throughout the neighborhood. So your defense is that the HOA can seize private property if they don't like how it looks?" Judge Harmon asked, her tone making it clear what she thought of this argument. "Not seize, Your Honor. Reclaim for community purposes as permitted by our bylaws." "Reclaim implies prior ownership," the judge noted. "Did the HOA ever own this portion of Mr. Mitchell's property?" "Well, no, but..." "And does your bylaw specifically permit the physical annexation of deeded private property?" Mendelson shifted uncomfortably. "Not in those exact terms, Your Honor." The judge nodded and turned back to Catherine. "Continue, Counselor." Catherine introduced evidence of the environmental impact next, calling Michael Mitchell to testify about the protected plant species that had been destroyed. The state EPA representative followed, confirming that preliminary findings showed violations of state conservation regulations. Then came the financial evidence. Dennis Takahashi testified about HOA funds being misappropriated to build the fence, presenting financial records that clearly showed the diversion of maintenance reserves without proper authorization. When Catherine called Carla Winters to testify about the pattern of selective enforcement and harassment, the HOA's attorneys objected strenuously. "Your Honor, these allegations about other HOA activities are irrelevant to the property dispute at hand," argued the second HOA attorney. "On the contrary," Catherine countered, "they establish a pattern of behavior that goes directly to the HOA board's intent and state of mind. They demonstrate that this wasn't an isolated incident but part of a systematic campaign to overreach." Judge Harmon overruled the objection, and Carla presented her meticulously documented history of the HOA's actions since Margaret had taken control. By the lunch recess, the courtroom was buzzing with whispered conversations. Several HOA board members were seen in heated discussion with their attorneys in the hallway. Local news crews interviewed homeowners outside the courthouse, many expressing support for Robert and sharing their own HOA horror stories. When court resumed, it was the defense's turn. Greg Mendelson tried valiantly to reframe the narrative, arguing that the HOA had acted in good faith based on their understanding of the covenants. The second attorney presented affidavits from 3 homeowners, all personal friends of Margaret's, claiming that Robert's natural garden had negatively impacted their enjoyment of the neighborhood. But their arguments crumbled during cross-examination. Catherine methodically dismantled each defense, returning repeatedly to the incontrovertible facts. The land legally belonged to Robert, the HOA had no authority to seize it, and they had destroyed protected plant species in the process. The final blow came when Catherine called Margaret Whitfield to the stand. Under skilled questioning, Margaret eventually admitted that she found Robert's garden personally offensive and had been determined to fix the eyesore since becoming board president. "And did you consult with a real estate attorney before ordering the construction of this fence on Mr. Mitchell's property?" Catherine asked. "We consulted with the HOA's regular attorney," Margaret replied stiffly. "An attorney who specializes in corporate law and not property rights. Did you specifically ask about the legality of building on private property?" After a long pause, Margaret answered, not in those exact terms. "Did you know that Mr. Mitchell's garden contained protected plant species? They looked like weeds to me." "That wasn't my question, Mrs. Whitfield. Were you aware of the conservation status of those plants?" Margaret's composure finally broke. "Why should I care? The entire neighborhood shouldn't have to look at his overgrown mess just because he decided to play scientist in retirement. We have standards to maintain." A murmur ran through the courtroom at this outburst. Judge Harmon called for order, then addressed both parties. "I've heard enough to rule on the preliminary matters. The temporary injunction will remain in place. The HOA is ordered to cease all activities on the disputed property. Furthermore, given the evidence presented regarding the environmental violations, I'm referring this matter to the state EPA for further investigation." She fixed a stern gaze on the HOA's attorneys. "Gentlemen, I strongly suggest you advise your clients to consider their position carefully before the full hearing. Property rights are fundamental in our legal system, and from what I've seen today, your clients have N." The Oak Ridge Estates Community Center had never seen a turnout like this. Every seat was filled, with residents standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The emergency HOA meeting, called to address recent legal developments, had drawn nearly the entire neighborhood. At the front table sat only 4 board members instead of the usual 7. Margaret Whitfield's chair remained conspicuously empty, as did those of her 2 closest allies on the board. Greg Mendelson, looking haggard after 3 weeks of intense litigation, sat beside them with a thick folder of documents. Vice President Tom Collins, who had always seemed uncomfortable with Margaret's aggressive tactics, called the meeting to order with visible reluctance. "As you all know, the HOA is currently involved in litigation with a homeowner regarding a property boundary dispute," he began, using the carefully sanitized language Mendelson had prepared. "That's not what it is, and you know it," called a voice from the back. Jim Padilla stood, arms crossed. "It's about the board illegally taking Robert Mitchell's land and destroying protected plants. Let's at least be honest about why we're here." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Tom glanced at Mendelson, who nodded resignedly. "You're right," Tom acknowledged, "and that's why we've called this meeting. Our attorneys have advised us that the HOA's position in this lawsuit is problematic." A screen behind him lit up with financial projections. "If we proceed to trial and lose, which our counsel indicates is likely, the HOA faces potential damages exceeding $2 million, plus legal fees and environmental penalties." Gasps and angry muttering filled the room. A resident near the front raised her hand. "How would that be paid? Would our dues increase?" Tom looked even more uncomfortable. "Our insurance won't cover this, as the actions were deemed intentional by our carrier. So yes, we would need to impose a special assessment on all homeowners." The room erupted in outrage. Residents began shouting questions about how this had happened and who had authorized the fence construction. Mendelson stood and raised his hands for quiet. "I understand your frustration. The board is exploring all options, including a settlement that would minimize financial impact to the community." "Where's Margaret?" someone called out. "This was her crusade against Robert's garden. Why isn't she here facing us?" Tom cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitfield submitted her resignation from the board yesterday, citing personal reasons." This announcement brought a mix of cheers and renewed outrage. Carla Winters stood up from her seat in the 3rd row. "Personal reasons? Let's be clear about what happened. Margaret used HOA funds without proper authorization to build a fence on someone else's property because she didn't like native plants. Now we're all facing the consequences of her actions." Dennis Takahashi joined in. "And this isn't isolated. I've documented dozens of cases where the board under Margaret's leadership selectively enforced rules, imposed excessive fines, and misused HOA funds." From the back of the room, Robert Mitchell watched silently as the community he lived in for 15 years finally confronted the reality of their HOA's mismanagement. He hadn't planned to attend the meeting, but Catherine had suggested his presence might be valuable. "Sometimes just being there changes the dynamic," she'd advised. "They need to see you as a neighbor wronged, not just a faceless plaintiff." Now, as he observed the growing anger in the room, he understood her strategy. This wasn't just about his property anymore. It had become a catalyst for the entire community to question the unchecked power they had ceded to their HOA. Mendelsohn attempted to regain control of the meeting. "We have a proposed way forward. The board is prepared to authorize a settlement offer that would restore Mr. Mitchell's property, compensate him for damages, and implement new governance procedures to prevent similar issues in the future." "What about the other board members who voted with Margaret on this?" someone asked. "Are they resigning too?" Tom looked at his remaining colleagues, who shifted uncomfortably. "The board is discussing leadership changes as part of the settlement negotiations." The meeting continued for over 2 hours, with resident after resident coming forward with stories of HOA overreach. What had begun as anger over potential financial liability was evolving into something more profound. A community reckoning with the culture of control that had taken root in their neighborhood. As the meeting finally wound down, Robert slipped out quietly. He heard enough to know that the dynamics had shifted dramatically in his favor. The following morning, Catherine called with news. The HOA's attorneys reached out with a revised settlement offer, she said, the satisfaction evident in her voice. "Full restoration of your property, $2 million in damages, resignation of the entire board, and a complete revision of the HOA bylaws to be approved by a homeowner vote." Robert sat down at his kitchen counter, momentarily stunned by the comprehensiveness of the offer. "They're giving us everything we asked for." "The state EPA's preliminary report came back yesterday," Catherine explained. 3 of the plant species in your conservation garden were on the critical watch list, with potential criminal penalties for their destruction. Between that and the community uprising at last night's meeting, they've realized their position is untenable. "The entire board is resigning?" "Yes. They'll remain in caretaker roles until a special election next month, but Margaret and her 2 closest allies are already out. The insurance company is also threatening to sue the board members personally for acting outside their authority." Robert thought about the years of subtle intimidation homeowners had faced, the arbitrary rules the petty power plays. He thought about his destroyed garden, the rare plants that had been ripped out and replaced with generic sod. "What do you think?" Catherine asked after his extended silence. "I think we accept," Robert replied finally. This was never about the money. It was about accountability and ensuring this couldn't happen to anyone else. "I thought you'd say that," Catherine said. "I'll draw up the acceptance papers today. There's one more thing. The settlement includes a non-disclosure agreement about the financial terms, but specifically allows you to discuss the property rights issues publicly. They want to hide the amount, but not the principal," Robert noted. 1 year later, Robert stood at the edge of his restored garden, clipboard in hand, conducting the monthly citizen science survey that had become a neighborhood tradition. Around him, a dozen residents carefully documented plant growth, pollinator activity, and wildlife sightings in the thriving ecosystem that now extended well beyond his property line. What had begun as a restoration project had evolved into something much more significant. The Oak Ridge Conservation Corridor, a community-led initiative that connected private native gardens throughout the neighborhood into a continuous habitat for local wildlife. Robert's expertise and the substantial settlement funds had provided the foundation, but the community's enthusiasm had transformed the concept into reality. "Robert, come look at this," called Eliza Rodriguez, a high school science teacher who lived 3 streets over. She pointed excitedly at a cluster of delicate purple flowers emerging beneath a grove of young oak trees. "The prairie gentian is spreading to the new section." Robert made his way over, noting with satisfaction how the once destroyed species was now flourishing across multiple properties. The rare plant that Margaret Whitfield had dismissed as a weed had become a point of neighborhood pride, featured on the new community logo and celebrated at the annual Gentian Festival that had replaced the HOA's formal garden tour. "Make sure to log that in the State Conservation Database," Robert reminded Eliza. "The EPA researchers will want to see the propagation rates." The State Environmental Protection Agency had taken a keen interest in the community's restoration efforts, providing grants and technical support that complemented the funds from Robert's settlement. What had begun as an enforcement action had evolved into a partnership, with Oak Ridge Estates now featured as a case study in community-led conservation. As the volunteer surveyors completed their work and gathered to share findings, Robert noticed a familiar figure approaching hesitantly from the street. Margaret Whitfield, looking considerably less imperious than she got a year ago, stood at the edge of the gathering, clearly uncomfortable but determined. The crowd fell silent as they noticed her presence. Margaret had moved away shortly after the settlement, selling her house amid the community backlash. This was her first appearance in the neighborhood since then. Robert handed his clipboard to Eliza and walked over to Margaret. "Hello, Margaret," he said simply. "Hello, Robert." She glanced at the thriving garden, then back at him. "I was in town visiting friends and thought, well, I heard about what's happening here. I wanted to see it for myself." Robert nodded but said nothing, giving her space to continue. "It's quite remarkable," she admitted. gesturing toward the interconnected gardens that now spanned multiple properties. Not what I expected at all. What did you expect? Robert asked, genuinely curious. Margaret sighed. Honestly, I thought you were just being difficult, refusing to conform out of stubbornness. She looked across the vibrant landscape where butterflies danced between blooms and birds darted among native shrubs. I didn't understand what you were trying to create. Few people did at first, Robert acknowledged. That's changed now. Indeed it had. The new HOA, restructured as the Oak Ridge Community Association to reflect its transformed mission, had embraced environmental stewardship as a core value. The rigid appearance-focused rules that had dominated under Margaret's leadership had been replaced with guidelines that balance aesthetic considerations with environmental impact. I've seen articles about this place in gardening magazines, Margaret said. They're calling a model for suburban conservation. Would you like a tour? Robert offered, surprising himself as much as Margaret with the invitation. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. As they walked through the garden, Robert explained the principles behind the native plantings and the broader ecological benefits they provided. Other volunteers joined them, adding details about specific projects and sharing the joy of discovery that had become the community's new shared experience. The irony, Robert told her as they reached the spot where the white fence had once stood, is that none of this would have happened without that dispute. Sometimes it takes a crisis to create change. Margaret nodded slowly. I still believe in standards and order, she said. But I can see now that my vision was too narrow, too controlling. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a television crew. The local PBS station was filming a documentary about suburban rewilding, with Oak Ridge Estates as its centerpiece. The producer, recognizing Robert, hurried over with her camera operator in tow. Dr. Mitchell. Perfect timing. We'd love to get some footage of you explaining the corridor concept for the documentary. Robert introduced Margaret simply as a former resident and excused himself to speak with the film crew. As he walked away, he overheard Jim telling Margaret about the dramatic decrease in water usage since the native landscaping initiative began and how property values had actually increased due to the neighborhood's new reputation as an eco-friendly community. Later, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden, the volunteers gathered on Robert's patio for refreshments. The monthly survey had become as much a social event as a scientific endeavor, strengthening community bonds that had previously been strained by HOA conflicts. Tom Collins, now serving as chair of the new community association, raised his glass in a toast. To Robert, who showed us that fighting for what's right can transform a community. Cheers erupted from the group. Robert, never entirely comfortable,